Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome back. Would the clerk please take the attendance?
Representatives Miller,
Here.
Heiss,
Present.
Stone,
Here.
Young,
Here.
Kofia, Devendorf, Fitzgerald,
Here.
Reingans,
Here.
Nyer,
Here.
Vanderwall,
Present.
Roth,
Here.
Beerline,
Here.
Smith.
Present.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Representative Young moves to adopt the minutes of June 14th, 2023. We will now hear testimony on House Bill 4852. We have quite a few folks wishing to speak to the bill, so I would ask that you please keep your testimony to 3 minutes to ensure that we're able to take questions. Members, please keep your questions limited to 1 per presenter to ensure that we can finish in a timely manner. We will now hear from Representative Reingans, who will speak to her bill, 4852.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Chair Miller and members of the committee, thank you so much for having us here today to talk about manoomin, which is a native grain here in Michigan, also known in English as wild rice. So this bill, HB 4852, would designate manoomin wild rice as our state's native grain. And I just wanted to describe a little bit why I'm bringing this to the committee. Last summer, before I was elected and a new member, I was talking to community groups across the state, and one of the groups was the Anishinaabe Caucus of the Michigan Democratic Party. And they have been working on making manoomin wild rice our state native grain for a few terms now. And only 3 states have a state grain at all, and none has a state native grain. So we want to make sure that we're able to honor our indigenous siblings here in Michigan to designate manoomin wild rice as our state's native grain. So this was introduced a couple times before, has passed unanimously out of committees in both the House and the Senate, but was usually done at the end of a term, and the clock ran out, basically, on getting this across both houses and across the governor's desk. So that's why I introduced it pretty early this term, so we could get it through by the end of 2024, hopefully by the end of this year, too. So I'm really grateful to have learned a lot about manoomin wild rice as I've been working on this bill and working with our partners. It's not just an important food source, it's an important spiritual and cultural part of Anishinaabe people's community, and the people who use manoomin and respect manoomin a lot more than I do will be talking a lot more about that. You'll learn about this from our tribal elders and others, and I really hope that we can designate manoomin wild rice as our state native grain, and I urge you to vote yes should we have the chance to vote on this at some point. Thank you. I don't know if you want me to take questions now or just all at once at the end.
Do we have questions for Representative Reingans? You have the floor, Representative Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry, I just have one question. Do all our states have native grains?
There's 3 states that have a state grain,
Okay.
but none that have a state native grain. Minnesota does have wild rice as their state grain. So, but we would be the first one to actually use the indigenous word in our state law.
I like when we're trailblazers, so thank you for that.
Thank the people who've been pushing this for a long time.
If we don't have any more questions for Rep. Reingans, we'll move into testimony.
Great.
Our first one that will testify this morning is Nat Spur, Vice Chair of the Anishinaabe Caucus of the NDP, Notawatsapi, Huron. Oh, and he's not here. Huron Band of Potawatomi. We will move down and see if he joins us later. Next, we'll have Nicole Kiwa Bieber, Treasurer of the Anishinaabe Caucus of the NDP, Little Traverse Band Bay Urawa, tribal citizen. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Minukijika, good morning. Nicole Kiwe Biber, Indigenous. Waganakasino Dawa Anishinaabe Kwe, Mishikidodam. I'm a tribal citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa, part of the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabe. And I am Turtle Clan. I also serve as treasurer for the Anishinaabe Caucus. I'd like to say about manoomin and the importance of having this be the native grain and why that is meaningful. And it would have to do with partly my age and the age of my children. I am 48, and it wasn't until last year that I was able to go to a rice camp where we have our jiman, the canoes. We go out in the traditional way, the way our ancestors did. And I was able to take my daughter, who was 12 then and is 13 now. So that felt good. She didn't have to wait quite so long to have that really central part of our culture. As a people, that's why we're here in this beautiful Great Lakes Basin, because this is the place where the food grows on the water. We hadn't seen her in a while. We hadn't had the ability for a long time to openly have these really central practices. It's a matter of what we are doing and when we are with the land. Maybe I could read about things, but it's not the same, is it? So for this designation, I think it's educational for even those among the residents of Michigan and the Great Lakes Basin who aren't Anishinaabeg. Because there'll be a question, what is Mahnomen, right? And they can learn that. And they can learn something I think that's really wonderful for us all. It's a story of recovery, not only of our cultural practices, but also of the Mahnomen herself, who will be there when the waters are correctly cared for. They have to have a certain cleanliness to them. And that's a measure, a presence, a restoration that we can all benefit from, seeing in real time. So this would be a wonderful thing for you all to, again, pass unanimously, and we appreciate that, you know, as your colleagues, and maybe some of you have been on this committee and done this before. And again, urge you to indeed please make sure everyone who can have this be passed and become part of our shared pride in our beautiful Michigan, and also as a really meaningful, respectful way to recognize our Anishinaabe culture. Miigwech.
Thank you for your testimony. Question from Representative Stone.
More of a comment, but I just wanted to thank you for elevating the importance of terminology, language, and culture in recognizing our first people of Michigan. That the Anishinaabe language underscores many of the words and names in Michigan, and that we shouldn't shy away from that. And so thank you.
Miigwech. And Barb and some of our other culture carriers may mention it, but just in case, for the word Mahnomen or Mahnumen, you know, there's variations, means the good berry. So it's that goodness, and there's a spirit sound in that as well with the Mahnu. So, Miigwech.
Representative Roth.
Thank you for testimony. Just maybe
That's all
one
right.
more. See, there you go. You talked about it going away and then coming back. Was there an effort there to bring it back? Maybe can you tell me more about where it went, or why it went away and why it came back?
There has been efforts to bring her back, and there's also, which is very interesting, sometimes she'll return when circumstances have changed. So with the naturalization of rivers, when, you know, dams are kind of like old and maybe not so much needed as people thought, it's very interesting how that will precipitate the return. And I will mention as well, when rivers are naturalized, sometimes fish species that have been gone for over 100 years return. So again, with the importance of that restoration that we can see happening, sometimes it's like really educational to realize that happens when we sort of get out of the way as well.
Thank you.
I'll pause now just in case.
Anyone else before we move on? Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Next, we'll move on to our next presenter, Nat Spur, Vice Chair of the Anishinaabeg Caucus of the NDP Nottawasapi Huron Band of Potawatomi. Thank you for joining us today.
Bonjour, Mano Waben, Nat Spur, Indigenous Bodway, Watabee, and Dow, Pine Creek Indian Reservation, Athens, Michigan, and Deutschbia. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nat Spur. I'm the Vice Chair of the Anishinaabeg Caucus through the MDP, and I'm also an enrolled member of the Nottawasapi Huron Band of the Potawatomi tribe. My house is located on the Pine Creek Indian Reservation, just about an hour south of here, just south of Battle Creek. We settled that land in 1840, got the deed to it in 1845, and my grandmother, who was a full-blooded member of our tribe, was born about a couple hundred yards from where my house currently is on the Pine Creek Reservation in 1922, at which point she wasn't a citizen of this country because the Citizenship Act of 1924 had not passed yet, and also English was not her first language. She grew up speaking Bodway-Watamie, how I introduced myself, in our native language, because that was how secluded and how isolated our tribe was from the rest of the world at that time, from the rest of Michigan. And so anyway, she met my grandfather, who was a full-blooded member of the Bad River, Wisconsin tribe, while he was stationed at Fort Custer during World War II. So imagine the two of them meeting, full-blood Indians, one from Wisconsin, one from Michigan, at a fort, military fort named after an Indian killer. So we'd like to get that changed at some point as well. But my mother, Laura Wesley Spur, was a full-blooded member of our tribe, full-blood Indian, and it was actually the leader of our tribe for the last 11 years of our life, of her life, up until her unexpected early death in 2010. I've been an elected leader of my tribe. I've been an election board member, a gaming commissioner, had a number of different roles in committees and boards with our tribe over the years. But I've been the vice chair of the Anishinaabeg Caucus for the past 3 years. And our goal at the caucus is to do what the National Congress of American Indians does for Native American citizens at the federal level. We lobby and like to promote issues and candidates that best represent the 12 federally recognized tribes of the state of Michigan. So we've got 5 in the Upper Peninsula, 7 in the Lower Peninsula. But over the last 4 years, this, along with decommissioning Line 5, have been the heart and soul of what we try to do. I brought this issue designating manoomin, or wild rice, as the state grain of Michigan to the floor of the United Tribes of Michigan 5 years ago, at which point in May of 2019, they passed a unanimous resolution asking for the state of Michigan to designate wild rice, or manoomin, as the state grain of Michigan. This has been the heart and soul, something incredibly important to what we do, because over the last 10,000 years, manoomin, or wild rice, has been the single most important food staple, the most important source of nutrition for our people. It's hard to get the figures estimated exactly or accurately, but I would say around most of our tribal elders estimated it probably accounted for about 40% of our whole economy and at least 50% of the calories that would last us through a Michigan winter. So around late summer, early fall, every year, right around this time actually, September is usually when wild rice is at its peak and is harvested. The entire village, the entire tribe of people would get together and scout and see where it was growing well, where it was not doing well, and it would be the objective of the entire tribe to collect, process, dry, and store wild rice to last our people throughout the winter. It was an incredibly important food source, and as Nicole previously mentioned, it almost became extinct over the last 150 years because of things like channeling, pollution, boating, dams, a number of other reasons. Wild rice almost ceased to exist altogether. Over the last 15 years, because I know there was a question about restoration projects or stewardship projects regarding wild rice, all 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan have been heavily invested in this initiative for the past 20 years. All of us have literally put millions of dollars into restoration programs for wild rice. Individually, we've done that. We've worked, as best we could with the state and the federal government, charitable organizations like the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. All of us have tried to work together as best we can. And if Manoomin were to become designated as the state grain of Michigan, it would make that so much easier. So much easier to qualify for free federal money, federal grants, state grants, and assist the tribes in working with these other outside communities. So it's something that's extremely important to us. As I mentioned, I brought this to the floor of the I asked for this to be brought to the floor of the United Tribes of Michigan. Everyone has thoroughly supported this. Over the last 6 years, since 2017, I've lobbied on behalf of this issue heavily. And on both sides of the floor, I think it's kind of unfortunate that so far this is a partisan bill that's been introduced by Representative Rengans, and I appreciate this committee bringing this to the floor again. I tried it during the 2018 legislature. I tried it during the 2020 session. 2022, we brought it to the floor again on both sides of both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Couldn't get it to come to a vote because we couldn't get the Speaker of the House to put it on the agenda. So this is the fourth time we've done this in the 102nd legislature, and it's so important for us. But my point was in bringing that up is, over the past 6 years that I've lobbied on behalf of this issue, it has been a bipartisan effort. My tribe, about 5 years ago this month, in September of 2018, Governor Rick Snyder actually visited one of my tribe's properties in St. Joe County and actually took part in harvesting wild rice himself. A Republican state representative from St. Joe County attended that event as well. The president of the Farm Bureau was there. I've spoken to, before the gerrymandering and before the districts changed this past election year, Matt Hall, who was our state representative for the 63rd district, which includes the Pine Creek Reservation and other properties we own, told me in writing he would fully support this measure if it came to the floor and he would vote for it. So I haven't heard a single complaint in the last 6 years from either side of the aisle, either Republicans or Democrats, who've said they've got a problem with it or an issue or any reason at all why they would not support this. It's unfortunate that it's taken so long to get it this far, but I appreciate all of your efforts in doing that. So in my language, Chi-miigwech, many thanks, and any questions you have, I'm here to answer.
Thank you. Representative Heiss has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think really you answered most of my questions, but one more. Whenever I've gone to the store to buy wild rice, it always says product of Minnesota. And so that had me wondering what the production here, I guess, is. I'm wondering why I've never seen product of Michigan on something like that.
Because it's not readily, the real stuff, the authentic, legitimate Manoomin or wild rice, it wouldn't be packaged like that. We're totally against any type of genetic modifying or manufacturing process such as that. All tribes in Michigan, all 12 of us have individual programs where we prepare it, but it's a sacred food source for us. it's not something we would manufacture and sell on a commercial basis to make money or to support ourselves. And we're not, even if we could do that, we're not at that stage in the process because we're just trying to bring it back. I mean, we're trying to care for it, reintroduce it to places where it used to be and it no longer is. In 2014, the Ceresco Dam, which is right near where a property that we own in Calhoun County, the dam was removed as part of the effort to clean up the river after the oil spill, after the Line 6B fracture that happened on the Kalamazoo River. And when that dam was removed in Ceresco, wild rice actually started to pop up. It had been there for 170 years. And wild rice remained alive underneath the soil, underneath the lake that had formed at the dam, because it wasn't exposed to oxygen. So after being dormant for 170 years, it popped up when that dam was removed. And it's just an example of how resilient that food is, that plant is. So. We're just trying to get it in rivers, streams, inland lakes, and trying to restore it to a fraction of what it used to be. Because I mean, but it's something that Native Americans or American Indians view as it's not just for humans. I mean, we see on my tribe's own reservations and properties that we own, right behind my house, where the Pine Creek flows and enters into the Nottawa River, which later joins into the St. Joe River, which goes out to Lake Michigan. It's a source of food for birds. When they're coming up to go north and they travel through the area where my home is, or on their migration right now when they're going back down south to spend the winter, they're incredibly reliant on wild rice that grows and forms in the month of August and September and October to make their journey down south to spend the winter. We've seen it with fish. Michigan DNR has had several projects throughout the state where they've cultivated or tried to expand wild rice because it's good for the fish population. It provides a sanctuary or a safe haven for them to grow when they're young and, until they're ready to go out on their own and go, out into the open river or into the open lake to sustain themselves. It's a source of food for mammals, things like muskrats. I mean, all types of, it's incredibly important to the ecosystem altogether from top to bottom. So American Indians don't view it as just a food source for us. I mean, it's something that it is incredibly important to the whole environment, to the whole ecosystem, and that's why it's important to us to bring it back and to be involved in all these restoration projects.
I really appreciate that it's important to the environment as well as agriculturally. Thank you so much for answering.
Thank you, Representative.
Representative Bierlein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2 questions, if I may.
You may.
Thank you. First one, have most of the efforts in restoration been concentrated on tribal lands, or is it kind of statewide?
There have been several groups that it's been important to. I mean, I gave a talk 2 years ago. I was part of a panel at the Water is Life event in Mackinac City for Labor Day weekend, and lots of members of environmental groups and people from out of state attended that event and, got to hear me speak about wild rice and its importance and how tribes in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan are, it's an important initiative for all of us. So we've been helped by many different groups. It's not just a tribal basis, but in the language of this bill, where we say it's important to indigenous people of the state, it doesn't have the same significance or the same importance to any other culture as it does to the people of the Three Fires in the Midwestern states of the Great Lakes region. For example, there are 11 different Potawatomi tribes. At one point, the tribe that I'm enrolled with was one giant tribe in the Great Lakes region. So we inhabited Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Ontario, and we were nomadic. We traveled around from place to place based on where our food sources were doing well and where we could depend on things like wild rice. We would move our villages around. So it's something that several other groups have helped us with and understood the importance, as does this committee, for agreeing to bring this to the floor and communicate with us about this. But it doesn't have the same significance to any other culture as it does to American Indians.
Thank you. Second question is just in the places outside of tribal lands where they are, like I know Houghton Lake, for instance, they put a couple patches. The DNR put a few spots in
Yes.
last fall, and the sports fishers up there are actually really excited about it because they know where to fish.
Yes.
And, but will there be plans on how to harvest those grains when they mature? With the tribes, or will it just kind of be a natural? That's going to be wildlife food.
I can't speak to that specifically because I'm not familiar with that project, but I can say for somebody to have invested their time into something like that, I'm sure there was a lot of thought that went into that and preparation about what would do. A lot of people don't recognize wild rice when they see it because at this time of year, people can mistake it for some type of invasive species. I mean, it doesn't look a whole lot different than a large gathering of cattails, or a lot of people think it's some type of weed. Even though Zizania aquatica, the river wild rice, is threatened and a protected species, and it's very abundant in southern Michigan, right around where my house is and where the Pine Creek Reservation is. A lot of people use weed killer Roundup because they mistake it for something that's an invasive species that's a weed. But in all the projects that I've been personally involved in, there's been a lot of thought and preparation about how to take care of the wild rice once it is successful. Thank you, Representative.
Representative Nyer.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think you've already partially answered the question. What's a typical environment, and where are the areas that we're currently seeing it have a resurgence in? Just describe a typical ideal environment where this thrives.
Well, wild rice, it grows in water. For anybody that doesn't understand that, there has to be water for it to grow, and it has to have exposure to sunlight as well. So typically where I've seen it do well is shallow waters that are, I would say, 1 to 3.5 feet deep, along the edges of rivers, streams, tributaries, inland lakes. And it also does well, you can't have a lot of boat traffic for it to do well. In places, especially where there's motorized boat traffic, we don't have it, currently, because of this, we don't have any regulations for harvesting wild rice in Michigan. And I think that having this designated as a state grain would help that. I mean, that would bring that about, because Wisconsin and Michigan are heavily regulated for harvesting wild rice. For example, if a group of people is going to go out in a canoe to try to knock down the rice and harvest it in this time of year, they wouldn't be allowed to use metal knockers. It would have to be wooden. There would be restraints on how long those instruments could be. They would not be able to use a motorized boat. They'd have to use a canoe and something that's powered by humans. There'd be size restraints on how long that canoe could be. It'd have to be made out of wood is typically a requirement. So the time of day, because you wouldn't want somebody harvesting in the early morning where there's dew and moisture all over all the plants, where you'd be destroying the stem, the plant itself, so that it would inhibit its ability to grow in future years and future seasons. So there would be a specific time of day where people are allowed to, certainly not after sundown as well, not during the night, where there would be more moisture. So there would be all sorts of regulations, as is the case in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So that's, for wild rice to do well, I mean, of course, it can't be in a place where there's a lot of pollution either, exposure to toxic chemicals. So there are several different requirements for the plant to do well. I mean, in my personal experience, we've moved plants around and we've seeded different areas and we've kept data on where it's doing well and where it's not. And people who have experience with it are well aware of places that it's likely to do well and where it isn't. Thank you, Representative.
Representative Diefendorf.
Good morning. I do not want to delay your progress on this long-awaited policy for much longer, but I did want to express my regret, and I'm sure it is several of our regrets that it has taken so long to make this change, and my appreciation for your incredible education, everybody who has come and presented today, on how our efforts to offer recognition can also do important public education and offer us that opportunity to really learn tested and effective methods for agriculture that may be growing out of practice as we are not doing the care that we need to for our environment and for our various cultural practices. So thank you so much for your presentation, for your education, and I'm enthusiastic to see us finally move on this and other issues for you.
Appreciate that, Representative, and it was an honor meeting you at that Clear Water Action event about a year ago.
Are there anyone else? Thank you so much. I should mention that it's come to my attention that legislative websites are down if anyone is trying to watch. We will now move on to our next presenter. Thank you again. Barb Borton, endangered species biologist and author of Manoomin, The Story of Wild Rice, will be testifying next. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about Manoomin today. I am going to talk about a topic that my Anishinaabe brothers and sisters are probably not going to get into much, and that's the reason why we've lost so much Manoomin. And this is from the European perspective, not the tribal perspective. If we take a look back in history, prior to the 1800s, prior to European colonization of Michigan, if you can imagine what our upper and lower peninsulas looked like, we had a lot of wild rice. We had rice beds along the Great Lakes coastline that were thousands of acres in size at the mouths of all of the rivers. We had rice beds on the inland lakes and streams and rivers. Some of the historical writing talks about the fact that people could not even navigate up the rivers because there was so much wild rice. And then things started to happen, and in my book this is detailed, obviously, but just to give you the highlights of what happened, and this is a successive, in terms of time, set of impacts. The first thing that happened was in the early 1800s, the Army Corps of Engineers decided that we needed to dredge and straighten the rivers at their mouths on the Great Lakes in order to facilitate shipping. And what that did was to basically go in and over time destroy these vast wild rice beds that once occurred there. Move forward a couple of decades and we have the logging era. In the logging era, there were a lot of dams that were built on the rivers to hold water back, to facilitate the running of logs in the springtime. Raising of water levels is detrimental to wild rice. It has very particular depths that it likes to grow in. Also, the running of the logs physically destroyed the rice that grew in the rivers, which I should add is a state threatened species today, the river rice. There was also a lot of draining of wetlands associated in the logging era to facilitate the construction of railroads to move the logs out, and also to create drier areas for towns near the logging camps, etc. I learned this in my research for the book, which I didn't know, is in the mid-1800s, Michigan, the lower half of the Lower Peninsula, was in the grips of an epidemic of malaria. And so the public health officials of the day had a goal to drain the entire state of all of its wetlands in order to protect public health. At that time, they did not know what the cause or carrier of malaria was, just that it was related to wetlands. So around 1903, I believe, over in Europe, someone discovered the mosquito was the vector. So they intensified the draining efforts here, plus added some kerosene and oil to the surface of the water to kill the mosquito larvae. As you can imagine, wild rice did not take well to the additional impacts of these chemicals and the additional impacts of draining. Moving into the 19-teens, a new form of agricultural practice came, a new form of farming was brought here by immigrants, and it was called muck farming. I'm sure, being an agricultural committee, you're familiar with muck farming. And that's where, in the past, they drained wetlands to get to the muck soils in order to grow root crops. It was a really good growing condition for root crops. In 1919, there was a lake in Grant, Michigan, in Newaygo County called Rice Lake that I believe was our largest inland wild rice bed. The lake was 3 miles long and 1 mile wide and surrounded by wetlands. It was completely drained to create muck farmland. It was also a known ricing area for the Odawa people. So we've got dredging and draining happening. We've got spraying of the water with chemicals. Well, now we're moving into the industrial age, right? And everyone has heard of the water pollution issues that happened in southeast Michigan and the River Rouge, River Raisin, the Detroit River, Lake Erie. All of that started in the industrial era, and there were vast wild rice beds up the Detroit River, all along Lake Erie, all up into Lake St. Clair, and many of those were also further damaged by these pollutants. So after all of that, in my research on the distribution of rice historically here in the Upper and Lower Peninsulas, it was a cold stop. There was not one more mention of wild rice from the 1940s on in the literature or in the old newspapers. And it wasn't until, as my friend said, probably 15, 20 years ago, I even know up at Lac Vitas here in the 1980s, they started to work on restoring wild rice, bringing it back. And through the efforts of various people doing rice camps and teachings, the movement to bring awareness to people here about wild rice has grown. The Michigan Wild Rice Initiative started up a few years ago and now includes several state and federal agencies, universities, all 12 federally recognized tribes. There's a tremendous amount of effort being done for the restoration and preservation and conservation of Mahnomen here in Michigan, and it's just absolutely fantastic to see. And I'm myself am just so grateful after dredging through that depressing history of watching these beautiful thousands of acres of rice disappear. To me, it's very important to get wild rice designated as our state native grain. And that's because, number one, it will provide an opportunity to educate the citizens here about the cultural and ecological importance of the plant. And that education will help to support the restoration work that's going on. It will help to build understanding between tribal and non-tribal people. Many folks who do not live near a reservation that are non-native really are lacking in education about our tribal brothers and sisters here. And so this will help a lot with that. It will help to increase wetland habitat, which, you know, I think we're still deficit in our wetland acreage here. And to me, one of the most important things is it honors the sacredness of this plant and its significance in our ecological landscape. I call it ecological amnesia, when something disappears and generationally we lose the memory, like the prairies that we once had here. And I'm speaking the non-tribal community. There are a few older hunters who have some vague recollection of the vast wild rice that was on Saginaw Bay, because it was a tremendous place for waterfowl in the migration season, and tremendous hunting was happening there. But for the most part, if you ask someone on the street, they have no idea that wild rice grows here. This will help take that lack of education and ignorance away. And I think it's just extremely important. I know that when something is named a state tree or a state stone or state butterfly, it's because of the connection that being has to our history, right? To our community, our story here, and the story of this land. And I can think of no better plant species to be named as a state native grain than manoomin, or wild rice. So I thank you very much for giving me a few moments today to speak with you about this plant.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions? Any comments? If not, we'll move on to our next presenter. Again, thank you. Next, we have on Zoom Roger Labine. Can you join us? Good morning. Can you introduce yourself, because I would do a disservice by your name and title. Thank you.
Are you ready?
Yes, we're ready. Good morning.
Bonjour. Bonjour. Meno Gazette. Matikwana Bay Indijnikas. Gigo do Adem. Ojibwa Anishinaabe and Dao. KK Gitaganing and Nunjaba. What I said is I introduced in my language as I would introduce to my ancestors and the spirits and beyond. What I said was Matiguna Bay, which is my name, is that spirit of the tree or spirit of the forest. And I belong to the Fish Clan. And I'm from that Ojibwa nation, that nation on the western tip of the Upper Peninsula, KK Gitaganing, or Lac Butte Desert. And the reason that I wanted to give testimony in this hearing today is because I've been working with wild rice restoration for 52 years. And my mentor recalled as a boy the waters in which our traditional homeland was on, that it had vast amounts of wild rice, just as there was vast amounts of rice all across Michigan. It was a staple food for my community, as it was for all of the tribes and indigenous people across the state. It was not recognized as the colonizers came and moved forward. And as Barb said, and a lot of other things, wild rice started to disappear. But being a member of the Medewan Lodge, wild rice is very, very important to our community spiritually. That's why my uncle wanted to bring it back. And so I worked very hard to make sure that the next 7 generations from today still have that gift. It was almost gone when I started. And I've been very, very successful. Over the years of my restoration efforts, I've encountered a lot of hurdles. One of the main hurdles that I needed to overcome was that this important sacred resource that we received from the Creator, it led us here from the East Coast. That's why we are here today. It was our staple food. It is in my community today. I plan on it that it being a sacred resource for the next 7 generations and 7 generations after that. But in my restoration efforts, I had to overcome a lot of things. We became federally recognized in 1988 as our own individual tribe. We broke away from our sister tribe, Keweenaw Bay Indian Community. And we were reorganized. We were once removed from our land until we actually went and bought it back as a community with the proceeds from the sale of our winter harvest of trapping. And we paid for that land the same way up until we became a federally recognized tribe. And so the obstacles that I have is that we have not appropriate land base like the tribes in Wisconsin and Minnesota. All of our efforts have been on public waters. And so when you come with public waters, there are a lot of things that need to be addressed. And as it's been stated so far in this hearing, there is a misinterpretation of it being a weed, being an invasive species. Riparian owners don't like to see it. So one of the biggest things that we have is herbicide. It took me many, many years to overcome the animosity between the riparian owners in our homeland, and especially around our traditional village. It wasn't recognized as a resource, and there was no protection for the resource. So all of our efforts were in vain many times. I've witnessed bed springs being dragged through our projects, so we weren't successful. They didn't want it. I sit on the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative. We're drafting a stewardship plan to help the state agencies, federal agencies, and the tribes to accomplish some outreach and education to make sure that it is well known among both indigenous communities and all communities and all people of the state. It's going to take a holistic effort for the return of Manoomin, and it needs to be done in a very procedural way. We met last week up in Roscommon in the draft. We got a draft that of how we are going to proceed. The passage of this, giving it a high status as a state grain, is going to enable this Wild Rice Initiative to move forward to get with that stewardship plan and enable them to, the people that respect this grain, to bring it forward. And so it would enable us to make sure that not only into the tribal communities, but for all residents of the state of Michigan, that as they become aware of Manoomin and how important it can be, not only to themselves, but to the habitat where it grows. It's been given the status as a keystone species. And if you looked at where a lot of the tribal reservations and where tribes are located, a lot of them are on or very close to wild rice beds because of subsistence living. Because it could provide year round. It wasn't for the jet ski and everything else, the big boats. And when the colonizers came, we were not consulted on how should we treat this rice, this wild rice, this Manoomin. So the passage of this bill, I believe would move us giant steps forward. And we could catch up to our sister states in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And those rice beds are doing well in those states.
Thank you. I'll take questions now. Representative Stone.
Thank you. You mentioned the stewardship plan, and I was wondering, is there a piece of that stewardship plan dedicated to education and awareness of the public?
I asked Jen Reed, who is in the water division over at the University of Michigan. Her and her staff are drafting a stewardship plan. So when the revision comes out, I requested her to, and she told me that once we formalize our mission statement as part of that stewardship plan, she would try to make it available to this committee.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you, everyone, for your testimony. I will now read in some cards. Whitney Grabel, Bay Mills Indian Community, is not speaking today. She does not wish to speak. She supports the bill. Ashley Stefan with MDARD, not wishing to speak, supports the bill. Representative Roth, you'd like to give
Thank
a
you,
question or
Madam
a
Chair.
statement? Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I think listening to testimony today, I'd like to make a motion that we voted out of committee today.
I'm good with that. So I would like to thank, again, Representative Reigans and everyone who has brought this forward and has testified. Manoomin wild rice is an important sacred grain, and as you can see, will be a resource for generations to come. So I understand the importance of that. So would the clerk please call the roll? Thank you.
Representative Miller,
Absolutely.
Heiss,
Positively, yes.
Stone,
Yes.
Young,
Yes.
Kofia, Devendorf,
Absolutely.
Fitzgerald,
Yay.
Reigans,
Yes.
Nyer,
Yes.
Vanderwall,
Yes.
Roth,
Yes.
Bierlein,
Yes.
Smith.
Yes.
Madam Chair, you have 12 yeas, 0 nays, 0 passed. The motion prevails.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. There being no further testimony, we will have Representative Peiss move to excuse absent members. There being no objection and no further business before the committee will stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.